Nestled in the picturesque coastal town of Carmel-by-the-Sea, California, the former home of Joan Fontaine, a revered Oscar-winning actress, is the subject of chilling rumors. Her elegant estate, a blend of classic charm and mysterious allure, has attracted whispers of supernatural activity since her passing in 2013. The focal point of these eerie tales is the library, a room that Fontaine cherished during her lifetime. This quiet sanctuary, filled with first editions, scripts, and personal notes, seems to have retained more than just memories. Visitors and caretakers report an uncanny atmosphere that grows heavier as one steps into the room. The air turns colder, and an unshakable sense of being watched envelopes anyone daring to linger. One former caretaker, Susan Mitchell, recounted a particularly unsettling experience. Late one evening, while tidying the house, she heard a thud echo from the library. Rushing to investigate, she found a book lying open on the floor, a biography of Fontaine herself. The oddity, the book had been securely shelved just hours earlier, and there was no draft or visible disturbance that could have caused it to fall. Susan's story isn't unique. Several guests have shared accounts of books inexplicably tumbling from the shelves, often landing open on pages discussing moments from Fontaine's life. Some have even claimed to hear soft whispers, indistinct yet undeniably feminine, emanating from the library when no one else was around. A local historian, Henry Carter, conducted an investigation and discovered a peculiar pattern. The books that fell were almost always connected to themes of loss or longing. "It's as if Joan herself is reaching out," he remarked. "This was her refuge, her safe space. Perhaps she's reluctant to leave it behind." Despite these unnerving occurrences, the house remains a cherished landmark in Carmel. Fontaine's legacy endures, intertwined with the mystique of her home. Yet, for those who enter the library, the question lingers. Is the ghostly presence a manifestation of her undying love for the written word, or a restless spirit unable to let go? The library's unsettling reputation reached its peak when a documentary crew decided to feature the house in a film about Carmel's most storied estates. Filmmaker Lydia had been a lifelong fan of Fontaine and saw the project as an homage to the actress's legacy. But what started as a passion project soon turned into an experience Lydia would never forget. The first incident occurred during a late-night shoot. As the crew adjusted their equipment, the sound technician, Mark, noticed faint static interference in his headset. At first, he dismissed it as faulty wiring. But then he heard something clearer, a woman's voice softly humming an unfamiliar tune. The song didn't match anything in Fontaine's filmography or the background noise of the house. When Mark mentioned it, the rest of the crew dismissed him until the cameras began acting up. Each time they tried to capture footage of the library, the camera would inexplicably shut off or distort the image. One playback revealed a chilling anomaly, a faint outline of a figure standing near the bookshelf, blurred but unmistakably human in form. No one had been in the frame during the recording, and the figure's placement aligned perfectly with the spot where Fontaine's favorite reading chair had once stood. Lydia, both unnerved and intrigued, decided to spend a night in the house alone. Armed with only a voice recorder and her notes, she settled into the library, hoping to connect with the spirit or at least understand the strange occurrences. As midnight approached, the air in the room grew oppressively heavy, and a distinct floral scent, reminiscent of vintage perfume, filled the space. Then, without warning, a stack of books toppled over, sending Lydia scrambling to her feet. She hesitated but turned on her recorder. "Joan, is that you?" she asked, her voice trembling. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, faint but clear, came a response, "You shouldn't be here." The voice was unmistakable, calm yet commanding, with the refined cadence Fontaine was known for. Lydia froze, unsure whether to run or stay. Before she could make a decision, the door to the library creaked shut, locking her inside. Lydia's pulse raced as she fumbled with the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The air in the library seemed to close in around her, suffocating and charged with static energy. The recorder in her hand, still running, began to emit a faint crackling sound. Through the hiss, she heard it again, a voice, soft and distant, repeating the words, You shouldn't be here. Panicking, Lydia turned toward the windows. The faint glow of the moon illuminated the room just enough to outline the shelves and furniture. But something else caught her eye, a shadow moving near the far corner. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a trick of the light. But as she focused, the shadow grew more distinct, taking on the outline of a figure, slender and poised, standing as though observing her. "Joan?" Lydia whispered, barely audible. The shadow didn't respond, but the room itself seemed to react. A gust of cold air rushed past her, causing the curtains to flutter and a nearby lamp to flicker violently before extinguishing entirely. Now bathed in near darkness, Lydia backed away until her legs hit the edge of Fontaine's old desk. The shadow began to move deliberate, slow, and impossibly silent, gliding toward the bookshelf that had been the source of so many disturbances. Then it stopped. The floral scent that had earlier filled the room returned, overwhelming and almost intoxicating. Lydia, both terrified and spellbound, watched as a single book slid off the shelf and landed on the floor with a heavy thud. The title gleamed in the faint moonlight, The Last Goodbye. Against her better judgment, Lydia bent to pick up the book. As her fingers brushed the cover, the recorder in her pocket let out a piercing burst of static, followed by a sound that froze her blood. A sharp, anguished cry. It wasn't just a noise, it was a wail, raw with grief and anger, echoing through the room as if the walls themselves were mourning. She dropped the book and stumbled back, only to hear the library door creak open behind her. Heart pounding, she turned, expecting to see another shadow or worse. But the hallway beyond was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the house's antique sconces. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. From the doorway, she glanced back at the library. The shadow was gone, and the room seemed eerily normal once more. But as she prepared to leave, her gaze caught the desk. Resting on the polished wood was something that hadn't been there before. A handwritten note, penned in an elegant old-fashioned script. It read, "Some things are meant to remain forgotten." Lydia hesitated, torn between the safety of leaving and the pull of whatever secret the house was hiding. A creak from behind her broke her indecision, a noise coming from upstairs, faint but distinct, like footsteps pacing back and forth, as if someone or something was waiting for her to come closer. Lydia stood paralyzed in the dimly lit hallway, the note trembling in her hand. The footsteps above her were slow and deliberate, echoing down the grand staircase. Each step carried a weight, a purpose, as if whatever was up there knew she could hear it and wanted her to follow. Against every instinct screaming at her to leave, she began to ascend the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, the floral scent fading into a faint metallic tang, like aged copper. Her shoes scuffed softly against the worn carpet runner, her breath visible in the icy chill that enveloped the second floor. At the top of the stairs, she hesitated, peering down the long corridor lined with doors. Most were closed, their dark wood reflecting the faint light of a flickering sconce. But one door at the very end of the hall was slightly ajar. A sliver of golden light spilled into the hallway, accompanied by the faintest sound of rustling paper. Lydia forced herself forward, her hand gripping the banister until her knuckles turned white. The sound grew louder, a rhythmic turning of pages, as though someone were reading. She reached the door and pushed it open slowly, revealing a room bathed in warm light from an antique desk lamp. It was Fontaine's private study. Unlike the rest of the house, the study felt untouched by time. The desk was immaculate, the leather chair pulled out as if waiting for someone to sit. Stacks of papers, neatly arranged, covered the surface, and in the center sat a photo of Fontaine, framed in silver. But what caught Lydia's attention was the open journal resting on the desk. The pages fluttered gently, though there was no breeze. Drawn by an inexplicable compulsion, Lydia stepped closer, her eyes scanning the neatly written entries. The handwriting was unmistakably Fontaine's, elegant and precise. The date on the most recent entry was startling, October 14, 2013, the day Fontaine had died. Her heart pounded as she read the words, "They come at night. They want what I cannot give. I hear their whispers in the walls, See their shadows in the mirrors. They will not leave me be. This house holds their secrets, and they will not let me go. Lydia's eyes darted to the mirror above the fireplace. Its surface was cloudy, tarnished by time, but as she stared, she saw something move in outline, faint but distinct. It wasn't her reflection. The figure stood behind her, its form blending with the dim light of the room, its face obscured but undeniably there. A cold hand brushed her shoulder. She spun around, but the room was empty. Her chest heaved, her breath shallow, as a new sound filled the air. A low whisper, not from one voice but many. It seemed to seep from the walls, the floors, surrounding her in an unintelligible murmur that grew louder with each passing second. Lydia backed toward the door, her eyes locked on the journal as the pages turned furiously, faster and faster, until they stopped on a blank page. Before her eyes, words began to appear, written by an unseen hand. You found me. Now you must carry the burden. The light flickered, and the door slammed shut behind her. The sound of the door slamming was deafening, reverberating through the walls like a gunshot. Lydia whipped around, clawing at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers that had once been soft and indistinct now roared in her ears, layered voices speaking in an otherworldly harmony, their meaning just out of reach. The journal on the desk began to tremble, its pages flipping wildly again, though no wind stirred the room. Lydia watched, transfixed and terrified, as the ink on the blank page bled outward, forming a strange, spiraling symbol that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Then silence. The voices stopped, the journal stilled, and the room fell into an oppressive quiet. Lydia's heart thundered in the void, her breath shallow and ragged. She turned back to the desk, drawn against her will to the symbol. Her fingers tingled with an icy numbness as she reached out, unable to stop herself from tracing its lines. The moment her skin touched the page, the house came alive. The walls groaned as though breathing, and the floor beneath her feet seemed to ripple, as if the old wooden planks had turned to liquid. Shadows erupted from the corners of the room, swirling and twisting into shapes that danced along the walls. One shadow broke away, coalescing into a figure that stood unervingly still. Its face was obscured, but its eyes or what passed for them gleamed faintly, fixed on Lydia. Leave it, the figure rasped, its voice a gravelly whisper that felt more like an intrusion into her mind than a sound in the room. Leave what? Lydia whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned toward the journal. Lydia followed its gaze, and to her horror, the spiraling symbol on the page began to glow faintly, casting the room in a sickly green light. From somewhere deep within the house, a rhythmic banging began, like a fist pounding against a heavy door. It grew louder, more insistent, shaking the very foundation of the home. The shadow figure tilted its head, as if listening. Then, slowly, it raised an arm and pointed toward the fireplace. Lydia hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her feet moved as though compelled by an unseen force. She approached the hearth and noticed something she hadn't before: a small, ornate key hidden among the ash and soot. Her hand shook as she picked it up. The moment her fingers closed around the cold metal, the room plunged into darkness. The only light now came from the symbol in the journal, its glow pulsating faster, almost as if it were alive and afraid. Behind her, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent, repeating a single phrase: the door must not open. What door? Lydia cried, her voice breaking. The pounding from deep within the house grew louder, closer, as if something was making its way toward her. Each thud sent vibrations through the floor, rattling the furniture and sending a cascade of books tumbling from the shelves. Then, she heard it, the unmistakable creak of footsteps climbing the staircase. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Lydia turned toward the locked door, praying for it to hold. But as the footsteps reached the landing, she realized with dawning terror that the sound wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from inside the walls. Lydia pressed herself against the door, her breath catching as the pounding footsteps echoed within the walls, growing impossibly louder. The rhythm wasn't erratic. It was purposeful, deliberate, as if something was trying to lure her into deeper panic. Her grip tightened around the ornate key in her hand, its cold weight grounding her for just a moment. The whispers shifted again, their once indistinct words now chillingly clear. The house remembers. The house watches. The house waits. A cold draft swept through the study, extinguishing the glow of the journal. Now plunged into near-total darkness, Lydia's only sense of direction came from the vibrations beneath her feet and the suffocating presence surrounding her. She fumbled for her phone, its small flashlight barely piercing the gloom. The beam of light fell on the journal, which now lay closed, as though it had never moved at all. And then the pounding stopped. The silence was worse. It was thick, oppressive, and filled with an almost sentient anticipation. Lydia felt the air shift behind her presence, cold and undeniable, pressing close enough to stir the fine hairs on the back of her neck. She turned the flashlight, her heart hammering in her chest. Nothing was there. But the moment she exhaled, the whispers surged again, overlapping and frantic, as if urging her to act. Her flashlight flickered, the beam catching a glint of metal in the corner of the room. She squinted, stepping closer to see it clearly. A hidden compartment in the fireplace, partially ajar. The edges of the bricks were smeared with soot and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The key in her hand seemed to pulse, as though alive. She knew, without understanding why, that it would fit the lock. No, she whispered to herself, shaking her head. Every instinct screamed to leave, to drop the key and run. But the whispers in the room changed their tone, pleading now. Desperate. Free us. Stop it before it wakes. Before what wakes? The question hung unanswered as the pounding resumed, closer now, shaking the very walls of the study. The shadows seemed to close in, twisting and writhing. Lydia's flashlight dimmed, flickering weakly, and in that instant, she saw it. A figure crawling through the narrow gap in the wall behind the fireplace. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, its head lolling at an angle that defied anatomy. Its voice came next, low and guttural, like the scrape of stone against stone. You've come too far. Lydia screamed, stumbling backward as the key slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. The figure snapped its head toward the sound, its empty sockets glowing faintly as it slithered closer. In a panic, she grabbed the key again and thrust it toward the lock on the hidden compartment. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, a cacophony of voices urging her on. Her trembling fingers fumbled, but the key slid into place. As she turned it, the pounding stopped, and the entire house seemed to hold its breath. The compartment opened with a low groan, revealing a small, dust-covered box. Lydia hesitated only for a moment before lifting the lid. Inside was an object wrapped in brittle, yellowed fabric. She peeled back the layers to reveal a rusted, ancient dagger, its blade etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under her gaze. The voices fell silent, but as she held the blade, a single voice spoke clearly in her mind, calm and chillingly resolute. You've made your choice. The walls groaned, and the floor beneath her began to crack. From somewhere deep within the house, a guttural roar erupted, shaking the foundation. Whatever was inside the walls was no longer content to stay hidden. The roar grew louder, shaking the room so violently that plaster cracked and books tumbled from the shelves. Lydia clutched the dagger, its cold weight anchoring her amidst the chaos. The walls seemed to bulge and ripple as though something massive was straining against them, trying to break free. The whispers returned, but this time they were different, clearer, commanding. Use it. End this. Lydia stared at the blade, its strange, shifting symbols hypnotizing her. She felt the house pressing in around her, the air so heavy it was hard to breathe. The guttural roar came again, and with it, the unmistakable sound of something tearing the wall by the fireplace split open, revealing a dark void that pulsed with a sickly, unnatural energy. From the void, a figure emerged, its form monstrous and incomprehensible. It was both shadow and substance, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a swirling mass of darkness, save for two piercing, glowing eyes that fixed on Lydia. The thing exuded malice, its presence filling the room with a cold that cut to the bone. Lydia stumbled back, her mind screaming to flee, but her feet remained rooted to the spot. The whispers grew louder, frantic, urging her forward. It feeds on the house, on us. Stop it before it consumes you. 2. The entity lunged toward her, its movements like a storm of shadow. Lydia's survival instincts kicked in, and she swung the dagger wildly. The blade slashed through the air, its edge glowing faintly as it made contact. The creature shrieked, a sound so piercing it felt like needles driving into her skull. The shadows recoiled, but only for a moment. "You cannot end me," it hissed, its voice a cacophony of tones. "I am the house. I am its soul." Lydia's grip on the dagger tightened. "Then I'll tear you out of it." With every ounce of courage she could muster, Lydia charged at the creature. The blade burned brightly now, its symbols glowing as though they had come alive. The shadows lashed out, tearing at her arms and legs, but she pressed forward, driving the dagger into the creature's core. The room exploded with light, blinding and searing. A terrible howl erupted from the entity as it convulsed, its form disintegrating into a vortex of black smoke. The walls shook violently, and the floor cracked beneath her feet. Lydia fell back, shielding her face as the shadows were sucked into the void, which collapsed in on itself with a deafening roar. And then silence. The house was still. The cold dissipated, replaced by an eerie calm. Lydia opened her eyes to find the room bathed in soft morning light, as if the darkness had never been. The journal lay closed on the desk, the strange symbol faded. The fireplace was intact, the hidden compartment gone as if it had never existed. But the dagger remained, lying on the floor where she had dropped it. Its blade was dull now, its power seemingly spent. Lydia rose shakily, her body aching from the ordeal. She made her way downstairs, the house eerily quiet, devoid of the oppressive energy that had once filled it. As she stepped out onto the front porch, she felt the warmth of the sun on her face. The world outside was vibrant, alive, a stark contrast to the suffocating gloom she had just escaped. She turned back to look at the house. For a moment it seemed peaceful, almost ordinary. But then, in the upstairs window, she thought she saw movement, a figure standing in the library, watching her. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. Lydia's heart skipped a beat as she realized it was the silhouette of Joan Fontaine. The figure raised a hand, as if in thanks, before dissolving into the light. But as Lydia walked away, the faintest sound followed her, a whisper, carried on the wind, "The house, always remember." Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.